Welcome back to the next part of the Dracula series. The story is reaching a fascinating turning point as hidden secrets slowly begin to come to light. Let's continue with today's chapter. Lucy and her mother's funeral. Lucy and her mother will be buried together. Dr. Seward helps organize everything for the funeral. Everyone is sad. Van Helsing searches Lucy's papers. Van Helsing carefully reads Lucy's letters, notes, and diary. He believes they may contain important secrets. When Seward and Van Helsing see Lucy's body, they are shocked. She looks beautiful, peaceful, and almost alive. Van Helsing puts garlic flowers around Lucy and places a gold crucifix on her mouth to protect her. Van Helsing tells Dr. Seward that he wants to cut off Lucy's head and remove her heart. Seward is horrified and cannot understand why. Van Helsing asks Seward to trust him. He says terrible days are coming and they must work together. During the night, a maid quietly enters Lucy's room. Seward thinks she is showing loyalty and respect to her dead mistress. The next morning, Van Helsing reveals that someone stole the crucifix during the night. He gets it back, but his plan must wait. A lawyer arrives and explains that almost all of the family property will now belong to Arthur Holmwood. Arthur is expected to arrive soon. Van Helsing makes sure Lucy's room looks peaceful and beautiful before he comes. Arthur is heartbroken after losing both his father and Lucy. He enters Lucy's room with Dr. Seward and looks at her one last time. Lucy looks even more beautiful than before. Arthur asks, "Jack, is she really dead?" He cannot believe it because she looks so alive. Arthur kneels beside Lucy and looks at her lovingly. Before leaving, he holds her hand, kisses her forehead, says his final goodbye. This is one of the saddest moments in the novel. After Arthur leaves, Dr. Seward tells Van Helsing that Arthur wondered if Lucy was really dead. Van Helsing replies, "For a moment, I doubted myself." This makes the mystery even stranger. During dinner, Van Helsing asks Arthur to trust him even if he cannot explain everything. Arthur agrees and promises to trust him completely. Van Helsing asks permission to keep all of Lucy's papers, letters, and diary. He says they may help protect others and discover the truth. Arthur gives him permission. That night, Van Helsing does not sleep. He walks around the house watching over Lucy's coffin, which is surrounded by garlic flowers. Mina and Jonathan travel to Exeter. The story changes to Mina's diary. Mina writes that she and Jonathan are now married. Jonathan is a successful solicitor. Their friend Mr. Hawkins has died. They attend his funeral. After returning to London, Mina and Jonathan walk together through Piccadilly. Everything seems peaceful at first. Suddenly Jonathan becomes terrified. He sees a tall, thin man with a long nose, black mustache, pointed beard, sharp white teeth. Jonathan immediately recognizes him. It is Count Dracula. Jonathan turns pale and almost collapses. Mina asks, "Who is that man?" Jonathan replies, "It is the man himself." The chapter ends with fear and suspense because Dracula is now in London. Jonathan keeps staring at the dark man in London. He whispers, "I believe it is the Count, but he has grown young." Jonathan is terrified because he believes the man is Count Dracula. Mina becomes worried about his health and mental condition. Mina gently takes Jonathan away from the street. They sit in a quiet part of the park. Jonathan falls asleep with his head resting on Mina's shoulder. Mina decides she must finally read the secret papers Jonathan brought from Transylvania. When they arrive home, Mina receives a telegram. The message says, Mrs. Westenra is dead, Lucy is dead, both have been buried, Mina is heartbroken. Arthur and Quincy leave. Back in Dr. Seward's diary, Arthur returns home with Quincy Morris. Dr. Seward admires Quincy's courage and loyalty. Even though Quincy hides his pain, Seward believes he loved Lucy deeply. After the funeral, Van Helsing suddenly begins laughing and crying at the same time. Dr. Seward is shocked. Van Helsing explains that people sometimes laugh during terrible sadness because it helps them survive pain. Van Helsing remembers Arthur saying that his blood transfusion made Lucy his wife. Van Helsing sadly jokes that if that were true, then all the men who gave blood to Lucy would also be connected to her. The joke sounds strange, but it shows how much grief and stress he is carrying. Dr. Seward believes the story is over. Lucy is buried. Everyone has gone their separate ways. He writes the word, "Finis," the end. But the real horror is only beginning. A newspaper reports a strange mystery near Hampstead Heath. Several children disappear during the evening and return the next morning. The children all tell the same story. They say they were with a bluffer lady. Their childish way of saying beautiful lady. The missing children are found with small wounds on their throats. The police think perhaps a dog or animal attacked them, but readers know something much darker may be happening. Another child disappears and is later found weak and pale. Again the child says, "The bluffer lady took me." The story strongly hints that the bluffer lady is actually Lucy Westenra, who may have returned from the dead as a vampire. Mina reads Jonathan's journal open book. Mina spends the day reading Jonathan's diary from Transylvania. She becomes frightened and emotional. She wonders, was Jonathan imagining everything? Was Dracula real? Did the brain fever affect his mind? But deep inside she begins to believe his story may be true. Mina thinks that if Dracula really came to London, she must be ready. She starts typing Jonathan's diary on her typewriter so other people can read it if necessary. She wants to protect Jonathan from suffering. Professor Abraham Van Helsing writes a private letter to Mina. He explains that he has been reading Lucy's letters and diaries. He believes Mina can help him understand important mysteries connected to Lucy. Mina quickly sends a telegram. She invites Van Helsing to visit her immediately. She hopes he can explain what happened to Lucy and perhaps help Jonathan as well. Before Van Helsing arrives, Mina feels nervous and excited. She believes he wants information about Lucy's sleepwalking. At this point she still does not fully understand the terrible truth. Mina finally meets Van Helsing. She notices his strong appearance, his intelligence, his kindness, his powerful personality. She immediately respects him. Van Helsing asks about Lucy's sleepwalking. Mina tells him she wrote everything down in her diary. At first she gives him the shorthand version as a small joke. Van Helsing cannot read shorthand. Then Mina gives him the typed copy. After reading Mina's journal, Van Helsing becomes extremely excited. He says the diary is like sunlight because it helps explain many mysteries. He thanks Mina warmly. Van Helsing tells Mina she is honest, intelligent, kind, noble. He says Jonathan is lucky to have such a wife. Mina is embarrassed but grateful. Mina finally tells Van Helsing about Jonathan's shock in London when he thought he saw Dracula. She becomes emotional and begs Van Helsing to help her husband. Van Helsing comforts her kindly. This is the moment when the stories of Mina, Jonathan, Lucy, Seward, and Van Helsing truly begin to connect together. Jonathan is feeling better and busy with work. Mina stays at home and reads Jonathan's diary about his terrifying experiences in Transylvania. She becomes frightened and wonders if everything he wrote is true. Mina decides to type all the diary notes so they can be easily shared if needed. She wants to protect Jonathan from more stress. Van Helsing writes a private letter to Mina. He asks for help because Lucy's death is connected to a serious mystery. Mina invites him to visit immediately. She hopes he can explain what happened to Lucy and perhaps help Jonathan too. Van Helsing arrives at Mina's house. He asks about Lucy's sleepwalking in Whitby. Mina gives him her diary. At first she hands him the shorthand version as a joke. Then she gives him the typed copy. Van Helsing is very impressed by Mina's intelligence and honesty. He calls her one of the good and noble women of the world. Mina becomes emotional while talking about Jonathan. She fears her husband may be mentally damaged. Van Helsing comforts her. He promises to help Jonathan. He says he keeps an open mind and does not laugh at strange stories. Mina gives Van Helsing Jonathan's complete journal. After reading it, Van Helsing sends Mina a letter. He says, "Jonathan's story is true. Jonathan is not mad. The Count is real. Jonathan is mentally strong and will recover." Mina feels relieved after hearing this. Jonathan meets Van Helsing the next morning. Van Helsing carefully studies him. Jonathan explains that the biggest problem was not knowing whether his experiences were real. Now that Van Helsing confirms the truth, Jonathan feels stronger. The two become friends. Jonathan agrees to help fight Count Dracula. Van Helsing reads a newspaper report. Several children are disappearing around Hampstead. They return with small wounds on their throats. The children say a mysterious bluffer lady took them away. Van Helsing becomes alarmed. Van Helsing shows the newspaper to Dr. Seward. Seward notices that the children's neck wounds look like Lucy's wounds. Van Helsing hints that Lucy's death and the attacks on the children are connected. Seward still does not fully understand. Van Helsing is preparing to reveal the terrible truth. Van Helsing tells Dr. Seward that he is too dependent on science. He says there are many things in the world that science cannot fully explain. People often reject strange things simply because they do not understand them. Van Helsing wants Seward to keep an open mind. Van Helsing gives many examples: hypnotism, mind reading, long-living animals, vampire bats that drink blood, ancient stories about people who cannot die. His purpose is not to prove these stories are true. Van Helsing gives many examples: hypnotism, mind reading, long-living animals, vampire bats that drink blood, ancient stories about people who cannot die. His purpose is not to prove these stories are true. He wants Seward to understand that the world contains mysteries. Van Helsing finally explains his lesson: keep an open mind. Do not let a small truth stop you from discovering a bigger truth. Sometimes people reject reality because it sounds impossible. Seward begins to understand. He agrees to listen carefully. Van Helsing asks, "Do you think the same thing that attacked Lucy attacked the children?" Seward answers, "Yes. He believes the same creature that hurt Lucy is now hurting children." But Van Helsing says, "No." And then he says something far more terrible. Van Helsing reveals, the wounds on the children were made by Miss Lucy. Seward is horrified. He cannot believe it. Lucy is dead and buried. How could she possibly be attacking children? This is one of the biggest turning points in the novel. Van Helsing is finally revealing that Lucy has become something unnatural after death. Van Helsing says science cannot explain everything. He teaches Seward to keep an open mind. Strange events may be real even if they seem impossible. The children's wounds are connected to Lucy. Van Helsing reveals that Lucy herself is responsible. The mystery of Lucy's death is beginning to uncover the truth about Dracula and vampires. Subscribe, like, share and comment. See you next video.